Beg me for a scraps and I might help you. He laughed at his pregnant wife at the gala. Unaware she is a secret trillionaire who saved his family business. What she did when his mother poured wine on her shock. Them and make them beg for mercy. The Manhattan Tower Hotel's presidential ballroom was designed to make powerful people feel comfortable and everyone else feel inadequate. But Natalie Foster had learned to navigate its architecture of intimidation over 3 years of attending galas, where her husband, Alexander Foster, treated her like an accessory that had lost its novelty. She was 28 weeks pregnant, visibly uncomfortable in designer heels that no longer fit properly. Watching Alexander work the room with the desperate energy of a man pretending his company wasn't 3 missed payments away from foreclosure. What none of the investors clustering around him knew, what Alexander himself had never bothered to ask, was that his wife had been systematically purchasing his family's debt, renegotiating their predatory loans, common and restructuring their failing divisions through a network of LLCs that made her the shadow architect of everything Foster Industries claimed to have accomplished in the past 18 months. His mother, Evelyn Foster, materialized like a storm front, her face arranged in that expression of permanent disappointment she reserved exclusively for the daughter-in-law who'd never been wealthy enough, connected enough, or honestly just enough to deserve a foster son. "You're looking rather worn, Natalie," Evelyn announced with surgical precision, her voice carrying to tables where socialites pretended not to listen while absorbing every word. "Perhaps motherhood will suit you better than this environment does." The insult was layered, simultaneously attacking Natalie's appearance, her fitness for high society, and her value being reduced to biological function, delivered with the kind of practiced cruelty that comes from decades of wielding social power. Alexander glanced over then, saw his mother managing his wife, and instead of protecting the woman carrying his child, he escalated the humiliation with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Beg me for scraps and I might help you." The words hung in air, thick with imported perfume and domestic malice, and Natalie felt something inside her, not break, but harden, as she watched him perform for investors who had no idea their confidence in Foster Industries rested entirely on the financial foundation she'd built, while they had been busy dismissing her. Evelyn stepped forward with a wine glass that had clearly been prepared for this moment, Bordeaux sloshing dangerously close to the rim, and Natalie understood with brutal clarity that this wasn't spontaneous cruelty, but premeditated humiliation. The wine hit her dress like a declaration of war, dark red spreading across pale blue silk, soaking through to her skin and the life growing beneath it. Gasps rippling through the crowd, not from sympathy, but from the vicious pleasure of watching someone's carefully constructed dignity dissolve. Natalie's hands moved to protect her belly, but her eyes stayed locked on Evelyn's face, then shifted to Alexander's. And what they saw there wasn't tears or shock, but something infinitely more dangerous: calculation. "You should be more careful," Natalie said quietly, her voice steady despite the wine dripping from her hem, "about whose mercy you've been living on." She turned toward the exit with measured steps, ignoring the whispers that followed her like shadows, her phone already out before she reached the elevator. And the message she sent was 3 words to her chief financial officer: "Pull everything now." By morning, Foster Industries would discover that anonymous loans totaling $320 million were being called in immediately, that strategic partnerships they'd counted on had mysteriously dissolved, that board members were receiving packets of information about financial irregularities they couldn't explain. By Monday, Alexander would be sitting across from auditors trying to understand how his company had been saved repeatedly by someone whose identity was protected by more legal barriers than a Swiss bank account. By Tuesday, he'd know the truth, that his wife wasn't just wealthy but strategically brilliant, that she'd been protecting his legacy not for him, but for their daughter, that every moment of his contempt had been cataloged and would now carry consequences he couldn't imagine. But the real question driving this story wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about what kind of woman chooses to save people who are actively destroying her, what she sees that they can't, and what happens when patience finally runs out. Why had Natalie protected the Fosters for so long while enduring their abuse? What did she value in Foster Industries that made it worth the humiliation? And when Alexander and Evelyn finally came crawling back, desperate and broken, begging for the mercy they'd mocked her for needing. Would Natalie's response be what they deserved, what they needed, or something far more devastating than either? Dear viewers, this story will immerse you in the complex psychology of strategic patience, teaching you that sometimes protecting something means protecting it from the very people who think they own it. You'll discover how financial power can be wielded as a tool of justice rather than revenge, how dignity can be maintained even when everyone around you is trying to strip it away, and how the strongest people often appear weakest until the moment they decide to reveal their hand. Natalie's journey will challenge everything you think you know about power dynamics in relationships, showing you that mercy isn't the same as tolerance, that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply remove your protection and let people experience the natural consequences of their choices. By the end, you'll understand that true strength isn't about making people see your power. It's about knowing your worth regardless of who's watching and having the courage to walk away from people who refuse to see it. Please share in the comments what lessons you learned from this story and what you would have done if you were Natalie at that gala. Would you have exposed their dependence on you immediately, or would you have let them self-destruct first? Subscribe for more compelling stories that entertain while teaching you about boundaries, self-respect, and the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself to be devastating. 3 years earlier, Natalie Chen had walked into the Foster family estate as Alexander's fiancée. But even then, she'd felt the weight of Evelyn Foster's disappointment settling on her shoulders like expensive fabric that didn't quite fit. The mansion in Greenwich had 23 rooms, but Natalie learned quickly that only certain spaces were meant for certain people, and the daughter of a state school economics professor would never truly belong in the library where Foster men had signed deals that shaped industries. Alexander had been different then, or perhaps Natalie had simply been younger and mistaken his confidence for character, his family's legacy for his own competence, his mother's approval seeking for the kind of devotion that might one day extend to a wife. But standing now in the presidential ballroom with her swollen feet aching and her daughter kicking against ribs that felt too compressed, Natalie understood that she'd married not a man, but a performance, not a partner, but a title that came with obligations she'd never agreed to shoulder. The gala had started 2 hours ago, but Alexander had greeted her with nothing more than a distracted kiss on the cheek before disappearing into clusters of venture capitalists and private equity managers who controlled the kind of money that could save Foster Industries or destroy it with equal efficiency. Natalie had spent those 2 hours navigating conversations where women asked about her due date with voices that suggested pregnancy was something vaguely inappropriate for formal events, where men's eyes slid past her as though she were furniture, where the only attention she received came in the form of pitying glances from servers who recognized someone out of place. She'd watched Alexander charm a consortium from Singapore, his hands gesturing broadly as he described Foster Industries' expansion into renewable energy infrastructure, conveniently omitting the part where that expansion had been funded entirely by loans Natalie had secured through her family trust and restructured through offshore entities he'd never thought to investigate. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 18 months building financial scaffolding around a company that was collapsing from decades of mismanagement, protecting a legacy that belonged to her unborn daughter, while the family that legacy was named for treated her like an embarrassment they tolerated out of obligation. But Natalie had learned patience from her father, a man who'd spent 40 years teaching economic theory to undergraduates while quietly building a portfolio that would eventually fund 3 university endowments and establish him as one of the most successful institutional investors most people had never heard of. Power, he'd told her once over breakfast in their modest Boston apartment, is most effective when people underestimate it, because they make decisions based on false assumptions about who controls the game. She'd understood the wisdom academically then, but she'd learned it viscerally over 3 years of marriage to a man who'd never once asked about her education, her investment strategies, or the trust fund her father had established when she turned 25. Alexander knew she had money, enough to be acceptable to his social circle, but not enough to threaten his sense of being the provider. Yet he'd never wondered why a woman with a doctorate in financial engineering from MIT was content to play housewife at charity functions. He'd never questioned the coincidence that Foster Industries' most catastrophic crises had been resolved by anonymous investors who demanded no board seats, no publicity, no acknowledgement beyond the kind of financial terms that were generous enough to seem philanthropic, but structured carefully enough to establish control without announcing it. Natalie shifted her weight, feeling her daughter respond with a series of kicks that suggested she'd inherited her mother's impatience. The baby was a girl. Natalie had known for 6 weeks but hadn't told Alexander because he'd stopped asking questions about the pregnancy after the first trimester, stopped attending doctor's appointments after the anatomy scan showed everything was progressing normally, stopped pretending that his wife's experience of carrying his child mattered more than the optics of having a pregnant wife at social functions. She'd chosen a name already, Claire, after her grandmother who'd survived the Cultural Revolution by understanding that survival sometimes required appearing smaller than you were, quieter than you felt, less dangerous than you'd actually become. Across the ballroom, Alexander threw his head back, laughing at something a board member had said. She heard his hand clapping the older man's shoulder with the easy familiarity of someone who'd never had to earn respect because he'd been born into a name that commanded it. But Natalie could see what the board member couldn't: the slight tension in Alexander's jaw, the way his eyes scanned the room, even while he smiled, the microscopic tell of a man who knew his empire was crumbling, but had no idea how to stop it. She'd seen that expression before, had learned to read it like a barometer measuring exactly how desperate the Fosters were becoming, how close they were to the moment when their contempt would transform into the kind of need that made people reckless. That's when she saw Evelyn Foster moving through the crowd toward her, wineglass in hand, and Natalie felt her daughter kick once more, as though in warning. Evelyn Foster had perfected the art of public cruelty over 6 decades of high society warfare. But what made her truly dangerous wasn't the cruelty itself. It was her ability to dress it in concern, to weaponize motherly advice, to humiliate someone while making observers believe she was actually trying to help. She approached Natalie with that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes, her Cartier bracelet catching light as she gestured with her wine glass in a way that made nearby guests instinctively step back to avoid potential spillage. Natalie recognized the setup immediately because she'd seen Evelyn execute this exact maneuver 3 times before. Once to Alexander's previous girlfriend at a yacht club dinner, once to a business partner's wife who dared to correct Evelyn's misquote of a Supreme Court decision, and once to a museum curator who'd had the audacity to suggest that the Foster family's art collection included a forged Degas. "You're looking rather worn, Natalie," Evelyn announced, her voice calibrated perfectly to carry to the 3 nearest tables, without seeming like she was projecting. "Perhaps motherhood will suit you better than this environment does." The words landed with surgical precision, each phrase designed to cut in a different direction. Worn suggested Natalie couldn't maintain appearances. Motherhood will suit you better reduced her entire value to biological function. This environment established that she didn't belong among people who mattered. Natalie watched the reaction ripple through nearby guests. One saw women exchange knowing glances that suggested they'd been waiting for someone to say what they'd all been thinking. Saw men suddenly find their phones fascinating because witnessing female social combat was beneath their dignity, but they'd definitely discuss it later. But what bothered Natalie wasn't the insult itself. She'd endured worse from Evelyn, had learned to let the barbs slide off like water on expensive fabric. It was the fact that Alexander had heard it and was now turning toward them with an expression that suggested he was about to make everything infinitely worse. She watched him excuse himself from the Singapore investors, watched him cross the marble floor with that particular stride that meant he was about to assert dominance, and watched him position himself slightly in front of his mother as though they were a united front against a common problem. His eyes met Natalie's, and she saw something in them she'd never noticed before. Not love that had faded, not respect that had eroded, but a fundamental absence of both that suggested neither had ever existed in the first place. "Beg me for scraps and I might help you," Alexander said, his smile sharp enough to cut, his tone suggesting this was somehow playful banter rather than deliberate humiliation. The investors he'd just been charming were close enough to hear, and Natalie watched their reactions with the kind of detached analysis she usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Some looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Some smiled because Alexander had smiled, so they assumed it was acceptable. Some openly smirked because watching someone get taken down a peg was entertainment regardless of who deserved it. The words themselves were devastating not because of their cruelty, but because of what they revealed about how Alexander had always seen her, how he'd narrated their relationship to others, how he genuinely believed that she needed him rather than understanding that for 18 months he'd been the one surviving on mercy he'd never thought to acknowledge. Natalie felt her daughter kick hard, as though responding to her mother's elevated heart rate, and she placed both hands protectively over her belly in a gesture that was entirely instinctive. That's when Evelyn stepped forward with the wine glass, and Natalie understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't spontaneous. The positioning was too deliberate, the timing too calculated. The way Evelyn had been holding that glass throughout the entire conversation suggested it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Bordeaux hit Natalie's dress like it had been aimed, dark red spreading across pale blue silk in patterns that would never come out, the liquid soaking through expensive fabric to her skin, and the daughter growing beneath it. The gasp that rippled through the ballroom wasn't shock at the act, but the collective thrill of witnessing someone's dignity being publicly destroyed, and Natalie heard that sound, that hungry, voyeuristic intake of breath, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even raise her voice, because her father had taught her that the most powerful responses are the ones delivered with absolute control. Her hands stayed protective over her belly, but her eyes locked on Evelyn's face with the kind of focus that made the older woman's smile falter just slightly. Then Natalie shifted her gaze to Alexander, and she watched him process what he was seeing. Not a humiliated wife, but a woman making calculations. Not someone breaking, but someone deciding. Not weakness, but something that looked disturbingly like strategy. "You should be more careful," Natalie said quietly, her voice steady despite the wine dripping from her hem and pooling on imported marble. "About whose mercy you've been living on." The confusion on Evelyn's face was genuine, the slight furrow between her perfectly shaped eyebrows suggesting she was trying to decode a threat she didn't quite understand. Alexander's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something more uncertain, but he recovered quickly because men like him had spent their entire lives learning to mask doubt with arrogance. Natalie didn't wait for either of them to respond. She simply turned toward the exit with measured steps, her posture straight despite the physical discomfort and emotional devastation, her mind already 3 moves ahead in a game the Fosters had just lost without realizing the board had even been set up. The whispers followed her like a wake. Comments about how pregnancy made women emotional, how she'd always been too sensitive for Alexander's world, how the Fosters had tried their best, but some people just couldn't adapt to a certain level of society. But Natalie wasn't listening to the whispers because her phone was already out, her thumbs moving across the screen with the kind of efficiency that came from having planned for exactly this contingency. The message she sent to her chief financial officer was 3 words: "Pull everything now." And she felt her daughter kick as though in approval as she pressed send. By the time Natalie reached the elevator, her CFO had already initiated the first wire transfer that would begin unraveling everything Alexander believed about his company's stability. By the time she reached the parking garage, her corporate attorney had filed the first set of documents that would reveal exactly who'd been protecting Foster Industries from the consequences of 3 decades of financial incompetence. By the time she sat in her car with wine-stained silk clinging uncomfortably to her skin, the first domino had already fallen in a sequence that would end with Alexander and Evelyn understanding exactly what "beg me for scraps" actually meant. Natalie placed both hands on her belly, feeling Claire kick with what felt like solidarity, and she allowed herself 1 moment of pure emotion before she locked it away and started the engine. The Fosters thought tonight had been about putting her in her place, but what they didn't understand was that Natalie had never left her place. She'd simply been waiting for them to reveal who they really were before she showed them who she'd been all along. Alexander Foster woke up Monday morning to 17 missed calls, but it was the text message from his CFO that made his blood run cold. "Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. Don't be late." He'd spent Sunday nursing a hangover and replaying Saturday's gala in his mind, trying to understand why Natalie's exit had left him feeling vaguely unsettled rather than vindicated. Why several investors had pulled him aside afterward to ask pointed questions about his wife's background that he'd struggled to answer. But he'd dismissed the unease as residual guilt, the kind that successful men occasionally felt when they had to make difficult social corrections. And he'd assumed Natalie would return home eventually, apologize for making a scene, and they'd return to the comfortable arrangement where she managed household matters while he managed everything that actually mattered. Except Natalie hadn't come home Sunday, and her phone went straight to voicemail, and the doorman at her father's Boston apartment had politely informed Alexander that Ms. Chen was not receiving visitors, and would he please leave the premises before security was called. The word Chen had struck him as odd. Natalie hadn't used her maiden name in 3 years. But Alexander had been too focused on the immediate problem of a wife who disappeared to think about the deeper implications of a woman reclaiming an identity she'd temporarily set aside. He'd driven back to Greenwich telling himself that pregnant women were emotional, that hormones made them irrational, sooner that Natalie would calm down once she realized that embarrassing him at a crucial fundraising gala had consequences she couldn't afford to face. The Foster Industries boardroom felt different when Alexander entered at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes early because his father had taught him that arriving early established dominance. But the usual deference he received from board members was absent. Instead of standing when he entered, they remained seated, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed panic. His CFO, Thomas Brennan, stood at the head of the table with a laptop open and documents spread across mahogany that had witnessed 80 years of foster family decisions. "We have a significant problem," Thomas said without preamble, without the usual pleasantries about weekend golf or market trends. And Alexander felt the first genuine flutter of concern in his chest. 3 anonymous creditors who've been carrying approximately $320 million of our debt across 7 different restructured loans have simultaneously demanded immediate repayment, Thomas continued, his voice tight with the kind of stress that came from understanding something catastrophic that he couldn't quite explain. The terms of these loans included clauses that allowed the creditors to accelerate repayment with 72 hours notice under specific conditions. And apparently those conditions have been triggered. Alexander sat down slowly, his mind trying to process numbers that didn't make sense because Foster Industries didn't have $320 million in anonymous debt. They had traditional credit lines, a standard corporate bonds, the kind of transparent financing that his father had always insisted on maintaining. But Thomas was pulling up spreadsheets that told a different story, showing a complex web of bridge loans and emergency financing that had appeared at exactly the moments when Foster Industries had been closest to collapse. "When did we take on these loans?" Alexander asked, his voice sounding strange even to himself. And Thomas's expression suggested the answer was going to be worse than the question. "Over the past 18 months, Thomas said carefully. "The loans came through shell corporations registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Each loan was structured to appear like it came from different sources, but the payment patterns and legal language suggest they're all controlled by the same entity. And that entity is protected by more legal barriers than I've ever seen outside of sovereign wealth funds." Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Come to the estate immediately. We need to discuss your wife." The word wife was in quotes, which in Evelyn Foster's communication style meant she was about to deliver information that would fundamentally change how someone was categorized. But Alexander couldn't leave because Thomas was now explaining that the mysterious creditor hadn't just pulled the loans. They'd also exercised options to purchase preferred shares that gave them voting rights on major corporate decisions. And they'd filed formal complaints with the Idaho SEC about financial irregularities that Alexander knew nothing about, but that apparently existed in documentation he'd signed without reading thoroughly. "Who is it?" Alexander demanded, his voice rising despite his training to never show emotion in business settings. "Who controls these loans?" Thomas hesitated, and that hesitation told Alexander everything he needed to know about how bad this was going to be. "The documents are protected by attorney-client privilege and multiple layers of corporate structure," Thomas said slowly. But our legal team managed to trace the ultimate beneficial owner through a series of trusts and holding companies. Alexander, the person who controls these loans, who's been systematically saving this company for the past year and a half, is your wife." The words hung in air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe, and Alexander heard them but couldn't quite process their meaning because they contradicted everything he understood about his marriage, his wife, Karen, and the fundamental structure of his world. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction because pieces were already clicking into place. The way Natalie had always deflected questions about her family's wealth, the fact that she'd never needed his money, the mysterious consulting work she'd claimed to do from home that he'd assumed was her way of feeling productive while essentially being a housewife. "There's more," Thomas said, and his expression suggested that more was going to be catastrophic. "She's also filed for legal separation, and the filing includes detailed documentation of every conversation, every business dinner, every decision made over the past 18 months. As her attorneys are arguing that she's entitled to compensation for 18 months of unpaid financial consulting that saved Foster Industries from bankruptcy 3 separate times. The documentation is airtight. Every email, every loan agreement, every restructuring plan has her analysis embedded in metadata that proves she was the architect." Alexander's phone buzzed again, but he couldn't look at it because his hands were shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since he was 12 years old and his father had caught him lying about his report card. The board member sitting to his left, Gerald Hutchinson, who'd been Alexander's father's best friend and had known Alexander since birth, cleared his throat with the kind of deliberate sound that meant something important was about to be said. "Alexander," Gerald said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment that cut deeper than anger, "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Did you know your wife was the one keeping this company solvent?" Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer that didn't make him look either incompetent or cruel, so he closed it again and felt the full weight of his own ignorance settling on his shoulders like the expensive suits he wore to prove he belonged in rooms where decisions were made. "She tried to tell me once," Alexander said finally, the memory surfacing like something from underwater. "About 6 months ago, she mentioned that she'd been reviewing our quarterly reports and had some suggestions. I told her that business wasn't something she needed to worry about, that her job was to focus on the pregnancy and let me handle the company." The admission hung in the boardroom air, and Alexander watched his board members exchange glances that suggested they were recalculating exactly how much confidence they had in leadership that couldn't recognize competence when it was sleeping in the same bed. Thomas closed his laptop with a sound that felt final. "She's given us 72 hours to arrange repayment of the $320 million. Or she'll force us into Chapter 11 bankruptcy and personally bid on our assets at liquidation," he said. "And based on the documentation her attorneys provided, she has both the legal right and the financial resources to do exactly that." Alexander stood up because sitting felt like surrender. But standing didn't make him feel any more powerful. It just made him more visible to the 10 board members who were all watching him with expressions that asked the same silent question. "How did you not know?" Natalie agreed to meet them on Wednesday afternoon, not because she wanted to, but because her attorney had advised that refusing would look punitive in court filings that might eventually become public record. She chose neutral ground, a conference room at her attorney's office in downtown Manhattan, 42 floors above street level with windows that overlooked the financial district where billions changed hands daily based on decisions made by people who understood that power was never about who spoke loudest, but who controlled the actual mechanisms of money. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early with his mother, both of them wearing expressions that attempted confidence, but couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. Haran and Natalie watched them through the glass partition as they whispered urgently to each other in the waiting area, like conspirators planning strategy they should have developed weeks ago. When Natalie finally entered the conference room at exactly 3 o'clock, she noticed several things simultaneously. Alexander's suit was the same one he'd worn to court his Singapore investors, but it looked somehow diminished now. Evelyn's usually perfect makeup couldn't quite conceal the sleepless nights that had aged her 5 years in 72 hours, and neither of them could maintain eye contact for more than 2 seconds before their gazes slid away like they were facing something too bright to look at directly. Her attorney, Margaret Chen, no relation, but the shared surname always made Natalie smile, sat beside her with a stack of documents that represented 18 months of meticulous record-keeping, every wire transfer cataloged, every restructured loan documented, every piece of financial advice Natalie had offered and Alexander had ignored, preserved in emails that would make excellent evidence if this proceeded to litigation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Alexander started, but his voice cracked slightly on agreeing, and Natalie heard the subtext clearly. He'd expected her to refuse, had probably hoped she would refuse, because then he could frame this as her being unreasonable, rather than him facing consequences he'd earned. Evelyn sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. And Natalie realized with some surprise that this might be the first time in Evelyn Foster's entire life that she'd been in a room where she wasn't the person with the most power. "I wanted to explain about Saturday night," Alexander continued, stumbling over words in a way Natalie had never heard from a man who'd been trained since childhood to command boardrooms. "I was under tremendous stress. The investors were pressuring me about the renewable energy expansion, and I said things I didn't mean in front of people who didn't understand the context of our relationship." Natalie let the silence stretch after he finished speaking, counting to 15 in her head, because her father had taught her that powerful people fill silence with confessions, while weak people fill it with excuses. "The context of our relationship," Natalie repeated slowly, her voice carefully neutral, "is that for 18 months I've been systematically preventing your family's company from collapsing while you've been taking credit for success you didn't earn and treating me like an embarrassment you tolerated out of obligation." Alexander flinched like she'd slapped him, but Evelyn's expression shifted into something harder, something that suggested she was about to make a catastrophic tactical error. "You trapped him with that pregnancy," Evelyn said, her voice tight with the kind of venom that came from watching everything she'd built over decades suddenly revealed as fragile. "You came from nothing, married into our family, and now you're using your father's money to punish my son for the crime of being honest about your place in our world." Margaret's hand landed gently on Natalie's arm in a gesture that meant, "Let me handle this." But Natalie shook her head because some responses needed to come directly from the person who'd been harmed. "My father built a $9 billion portfolio starting with $100,000 and 40 years of patience," Natalie said quietly, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. "He taught me that real power isn't inherited. It's constructed through competence, discipline, and understanding that most people will underestimate you if you let them. And that underestimation becomes your greatest advantage." She pulled a document from the stack in front of Margaret and slid it across the polished conference table toward Alexander. "This is a complete accounting of every dollar I've invested in Foster Industries, every loan I've restructured, every crisis I've resolved while you were busy performing competence for investors who would have abandoned you the moment they understood how precarious your actual position was," Natalie continued. "The total comes to $320 million in direct capital, plus another $180 million in opportunity costs from deals I didn't pursue because I was focused on saving your legacy. That's $500 million, Alexander, that I spent protecting a company whose owner told me to beg him for scraps." Alexander's hands trembled as he pulled the document closer, his eyes scanning numbers that apparently made sense in a way that devastated him because his face went pale, and he pushed back from the table like the paper itself was toxic. "I didn't know," he whispered, and Natalie almost felt sorry for him because the truth was evident in every line of his body. He genuinely hadn't known, hadn't asked, hadn't considered that his wife might be capable of operating at a level that made his own business acumen look like amateur hour. "That's the problem," Natalie said. "You didn't know because you never asked. Because you assumed that a woman who loved you enough to marry you couldn't possibly be smart enough to do what I've been doing every day for 18 months. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against hardwood in a sound that felt violent in the quiet room. "What do you want?" she demanded, and Natalie heard the break in her voice that meant they'd reached the part of the meeting where the Fosters finally understood they were here to beg, not negotiate. "I want you to understand what you destroyed," Natalie said simply. "I loved your son, believed in his potential, thought that if I supported him quietly, He'd eventually see me as a partner rather than an accessory. I spent 18 months proving my value in the only language your family understands, money. And the moment I needed you to defend me against public humiliation, you joined in like it was entertainment. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling Claire kick as though reminding her mother why this conversation mattered beyond wounded pride or financial justice. I'm going to have your daughter in 3 months, Natalie continued. She'll be a foster by name, and she deserves a legacy that isn't built on contempt and financial incompetence. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to restructure Foster Industries completely, install new management, and establish a trust that protects the company for Claire's future. You, Alexander, will retain a minority stake in a consulting position if you agree to therapy and demonstrate actual competence. You, Evelyn, White, will have no role in the company or in my daughter's life until you can articulate exactly what you did wrong and why it was unforgivable. The terms hung in air that felt charged with the weight of consequences finally arriving at their destination. And if we refuse? Evelyn asked, but her voice had lost its edge because they both knew refusal wasn't actually an option. Then I'll force Foster Industries into bankruptcy, purchase it at liquidation for approximately 30 cents on the dollar, and rebuild it under a name that doesn't carry the stink of people who mistake cruelty for strength, Natalie said calmly. Your choice is between humbling yourselves enough to deserve mercy or losing everything and watching me build something better from the ruins. Alexander's face crumpled in a way that might have moved Natalie 6 months ago. But she'd learned that tears from powerful people often meant they were sorry they'd been caught rather than sorry for what they'd done. I'll sign whatever you want, Alexander said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do the therapy. I'll take the consulting position. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you thought you married. Natalie looked at him across the table and felt something complicated. Not love, because that had been burned away by wine and laughter and 18 months of invisible labor. But not quite hatred either. Something closer to exhausted recognition that people were capable of change only after they'd lost everything that had allowed them to avoid it. The documents will be ready by Friday, Margaret said, her voice crisp with professional efficiency. You'll have 72 hours to review them before signing, and the terms are non-negotiable. Evelyn and Alexander stood to leave, but at the door, Evelyn turned back with an expression that almost approached human. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I underestimated you, and that was stupid, and I'm sorry. Natalie nodded once, acknowledging the apology without accepting it, because some wounds required more than words to heal. After they left, Margaret turned to Natalie with something like admiration in her eyes. That was remarkably restrained, she said. I expected you to eviscerate them. Natalie placed both hands on her belly, feeling her daughter move beneath her palms, and she thought about the kind of mother she wanted to be, on the kind of woman she wanted Claire to see when she was old enough to understand what had happened in this conference room. They eviscerated themselves, Natalie said finally. I just removed my protection and let them experience the consequences of their own choices. That's not revenge. That's just reality finally arriving after being delayed by my mercy. She gathered her documents and stood, her body heavy with pregnancy and exhaustion, but her mind clear with the kind of clarity that comes from finally choosing yourself after months of choosing everyone else. By the time she reached the parking garage, Alexander had sent 17 text messages that ranged from apology to anger to desperate promises, but Natalie deleted them all without reading past the first line, because she'd learned that some people only valued what they'd lost. And that kind of love, if it could even be called love, was something she'd never teach her daughter to accept. Dear viewers, you've just witnessed the complete story of Natalie Foster, a woman who understood that true power isn't about making people see your strength, but about knowing your worth regardless of who's watching. This story taught us that mercy extended to people who don't value it becomes enablement, that silence can be strategic rather than weak, and that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply remove your protection and let people face the natural consequences of their cruelty. You've learned that financial intelligence can be emotional survival, that patience is a form of power when wielded intentionally, and that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. and especially when you're protecting someone who can't protect themselves yet. Now it's your turn. Drop in the comments what lessons you learned from Natalie's journey. Would you have revealed your power at the gala immediately? Or would you have played the long game like Natalie did? What would you have done differently if you were in her position when that wine was poured? How would you have responded to Alexander and Evelyn's begging, with the structured mercy Natalie offered, or with something harsher? Subscribe for more stories that entertain while teaching you about boundaries, self-respect, power dynamics, and the strength it takes to walk away from people who refuse to see your value. These aren't just stories. They're lessons in human psychology, strategic thinking, and the kind of dignity that can't be stolen, only surrendered. Thank you for watching, and remember, the quietest person in the room might just be the one controlling everything.